The new learning of the Renascence had not as yet taken much hold in England. Upon the whole, the productions of Caxton's press were mostly of a kind that may be described as mediaeval, and the most important of them, if we except his edition of Chaucer, was that "noble and joyous book," as Caxton called it, Le Morte d'Arthur, written by Sir Thomas Malory in 1469 and printed by Caxton in 1485. This was a compilation from French Arthur romances, and was by far the best English prose that had yet been written. It may be doubted, indeed, whether for purposes of simple story telling the picturesque charm of Malory's style has been improved upon. The episode which lends its name to the whole romance, the death of Arthur, is most impressively told, and Tennyson has followed Malory's narrative closely, even to such details of the scene as the little chapel by the sea, the moonlight, and the answer which Sir Bedwyr made the wounded king, when bidden to throw Excalibur into the water. "What saw thou there?" said the king. "Sir," he said, "I saw nothing but the waters wap and the waves wan. I heard the ripple washing in the reeds, and the wild water lapping on the crag." And very touching and beautiful is the oft quoted lament of Sir Ector over Launcelot in Malory's final chapter. "Ah, Launcelot," he said, "thou were head of all Christian knights, and now, I dare say," said Sir Ector, "thou, Sir Launcelot, there thou liest, that thou were never matched of earthly knight's hand, and thou were the courteous knight that ever bare a shield, and thou were the truest friend to thy lover that ever bestrode horse, and thou were the truest lover of a sinful man that ever loved woman, and thou were the kindest man that ever strake with sword, and thou were the goodliest person ever came among press of knights, and thou were the meekest man, and the gentlest that ever ate in hall among ladies, and thou were the sternest knight to thy mortal foe that ever put spear in the rest." Equally good, as an example of English prose narrative, was the translation made by John Bourchier, Lord Berners, of that most brilliant of the French chroniclers, Chaucer's contemporary, Sir John Froissart. Lord Berners was the English governor of Calais, and his version of Froissart's chronicles was made in 1523-25, at the request of Henry VIII. In these two books English chivalry spoke its last genuine word. In Sir Philip Sidney the character of the knight was merged into that of the modern gentleman, and although tournaments were still held in the reign of Elizabeth, and Spenser cast his Faery Queen into the form of a chivalry romance, these were but a ceremonial survival and literary tradition from an order of things that had passed away. How antagonistic the new classical culture was to the vanished ideal of the Middle Age may be read in Toxophilus, a treatise on archery published in 1545 by Roger Ascham, a Greek lecturer in Cambridge, and the tutor of the Princess Elizabeth and Lady Jane Grey. In our forefathers' time, when papistry as a standing pool covered and overflowed all England, few books were read in our tongue, saving certain books of chivalry, as they said, for pastime and pleasure, which, as some say, were made in monasteries by idle monks or wanton canons, as one, for example, Morte d'Arthur, the whole pleasure of which book standeth in two special points, in open manslaughter and bold bawdry. This is good stuff for wise men to laugh at, or honest men to take pleasure at. Yet I know, when God's Bible was banished the court, and Morte d'Arthur received into the prince's chamber. The fashionable school of courtly allegory, first introduced into England by the translation of the Roman of the Rose, reached its extremity in Stephen Hawes' Pastime of Pleasure, printed by Caxton's successor, Wynkyn de Worde, in 1517. This was a dreary and pedantic poem, in which it is told how Graund Amour, after a long series of adventures and instructions among such shadowy personages as Verite, Observance, Falsehood, and Good Operation, finally won the love of La Belle Pucelle. Hawes was the last English poet of note whose culture was exclusively mediaeval. His contemporary, John Skelton, mingled the old fashions with the new classical learning. In his Bauge of Court, Court Entertainment or Dole, and in others of his earlier pieces, he used, like Hawes, Chaucer's 7-line stanza. But his later poems were mostly written in a verse of his own invention, called after him Skeltonical. This was a sort of glorified doggerel, in short, swift, ragged lines, with occasional intermixture of French and Latin. Her beauty to augment, Dame Nature hath her lent a wart upon her cheek, who so list to seek in her visage a scar, that seemeth from afar like to the radiant star, all with favor fret, so properly it is set. She is the violet, the daisy delectable, the columbine commendable, the jellifer amiable. For this most goodly flower, this blossom of fresh color, so Jupiter me succor, she flourisheth new and new in beauty and virtue, hac claritate gemina, o gloriosa femina, etc. Skelton was a rude, railing rhymer, and a singular mixture of a true and original poet with a buffoon, coarse as Rabelais, whimsical, obscure, but always vivacious. He was the rector of Diss, in Norfolk, but his profane and scurrilous wit seems rather out of keeping with his clerical character. His Tunning of Eleanor Rumming is a study of very low life, reminding one slightly of Burns's Jolly Beggars. His Philip Sparrow is a sportive, pretty, fantastic elegy on the death of a pet bird belonging to Mistress Joanna Scroop of Carow, and has been compared to the Latin poet Catullus's elegy on Lesbia's sparrow. In Speke, Parrot, and Why Come Ye Not to Court, he assailed the powerful Cardinal Wolsey with the most ferocious satire, and was, in consequence, obliged to take sanctuary at Westminster, where he died in 1529. Skelton was a classical scholar, and at one time tutor to Henry VIII. The great humanist Erasmus spoke of him as the one light and ornament of British letters. Caxton asserts that he had read Virgil, Ovid, and Tully, and quaintly adds, "I suppose he hath drunken of Elison's well." In refreshing contrast with the artificial court poetry of the 15th and the first three-quarters of the 16th century was the folk poetry, the popular ballad literature which was handed down by oral tradition. The English and Scotch ballads were narrative songs written in a variety of meters, but chiefly in what is known as the ballad stanza. In summer when the shaws be shane, and leaves be large and long, it is full merry in fair forest to hear the fowl's song, to see the deer draw to the dale and leave the hillies hie, and shadow them in the leaves green under the greenwood tree. It is not possible to assign a definite date to these ballads. They lived on the lips of the people, and were seldom reduced to writing till many years after they were first composed and sung. Meanwhile they underwent repeated changes, so that we have numerous versions of the same story. They belonged to no particular author, but, like all folklore, were handed freely by the unknown poets, minstrels, and ballad reciters who modernized their language, added to them, or corrupted them, and passed them along. Coming out of an uncertain past, based on some dark legend of heartbreak or bloodshed, they bear no poet's name, but are ferae naturae, and have the flavor of wild game. In the forms in which they are preserved, few of them are older than the 17th century, or the latter part of the 16th century, though many, in their original shape, are doubtless much older. A very few of the Robin Hood ballads go back to the 15th century, and to the same period is assigned the charming ballad of the Nut Brown Maid, and the famous border ballad of Chevy Chase, which describes a battle between the retainers of the two great houses of Douglas and Percy. It was this song of which Sir Philip Sidney wrote, "I never heard the old song of Percy and Douglas, but I found myself more moved than by a trumpet, and yet it is sung but by some blind crowder, with no rougher voice than rude style." But the style of the ballads was not always rude. In their compressed energy of expression, in the impassioned, abrupt, yet indirect way in which they tell their tale of grief and horror, there reside often a tragic power and art superior to any English poetry that had been written since Chaucer, superior even to Chaucer in the quality of intensity. The true home of the ballad literature was the North Country, and especially the Scotch border, where the constant forays of moss troopers and the raids and private warfare of the lords of the marches supplied many traditions of heroism, like those celebrated in the old poem The Battle of Otterbourne, and in the hunting of the Cheviot, or Chevy Chase, already mentioned. Some of these are Scotch and others English. The dialect of Lowland Scotland did not in effect differ much from that of Northumberland and Yorkshire, both descended alike from the old Northumbrian of Anglo-Saxon times. Other ballads were shortened, popular versions of the chivalry romances which were passing out of fashion among educated readers in the 16th century, and now fell into the hands of the ballad makers. Others preserved the memory of local countryside tales, family feuds, and tragic incidents, partly historical and partly legendary, associated often with particular spots. Such are, for example, the Dowie Dens of Yarrow, Fair Helen of Kirkconnell, the Forsaken Bride, and the Twa Corbies. Others, again, have a coloring of popular superstition, like the beautiful ballad concerning Thomas of Erceldoune, who goes in at Eldon Hill with an elf queen, and spends 7 years in Fairyland. But the most popular of all the ballads were those which cluster about the name of that good outlaw Robin Hood, who with his merry men hunted the forest of merry Sherwood, where he killed the king's deer and waylaid rich travellers, but was kind to poor knights and honest workmen. Robin Hood is the true ballad hero, the darling of the common people, as Arthur was of the nobles. The names of his confessor, Friar Tuck, his mistress, Maid Marian, his companions, Little John, Scathelock, and Much, the miller's son, were as familiar as household words. Langland, in the 14th century, mentions rhymes of Robin Hood, and efforts have been made to identify him with some actual personage, as with one of the dispossessed barons who had been adherents of Simon de Montfort in his war against Henry III. But there seems to be nothing historical about Robin Hood. He was a creation of the popular fancy. The game laws under the Norman kings were very oppressive, and there were doubtless dim memories still cherished among the Saxon masses of Hereward and Edric the Wild, who had defied the power of the Conqueror, as well as of later freebooters, who had taken to the woods and lived by plunder. Robin Hood was a thoroughly national character. He had the English love of fair play, the English readiness to shake hands and make up, and keep no malice when worsted in a square fight. He beat and plundered the rich bishops and abbots, who had more than their fair share of wealth, but he was generous and hospitable to the distressed, and lived a free and careless life in the good green wood. He was a mighty archer, with those national weapons, the long-bow and the cloth-yard shaft. He tricked and baffled legal authority in the person of the proud Sheriff of Nottingham, thereby appealing to that secret sympathy with lawlessness and adventure which marked the free-born, vigorous yeomanry of England. And finally, the scenery of the forest gives a poetic background and a never-failing charm to the exploits of the old Robin Hood of England and his merry men. The ballads came, in time, to have a certain tricks of style such as are apt to characterize a body of anonymous folk poetry. Such is their use of conventional epithets, the red, red gold, the good green wood, the gray goose wing. Such are certain recurring terms of phrase like, "but out and spake their stepmother." Such is, finally, a kind of sing-song repetition, which doubtless helped the ballad singer to memorize his stock, as, for example, "She hadna put a double rose, a rose but only twae." Or again, "And many one sings O grass, and many one sings o corn, and many one sings o Robin Hood, kens little where he was born. It was na in the ha, nor in the painted bower, but it was in the good green wood, among the lily flower." Copies of some of these old ballads were hawked about in the 16th century, printed in black letter, broadsides, or single sheets. Wynkyn de Worde printed in 1489 a Little Gest of Robin Hood, which is a sort of digest of earlier ballads on the subject. In the 17th century a few of the English popular ballads were collected in miscellanies called garlands. Early in the 18th century the Scotch poet Allan Ramsay published a number of Scotch ballads in the Evergreen and the Tea Table Miscellany. But no large and important collection was put forth until Percy's Reliques, 1765, a book which had a powerful influence upon Wordsworth and Walter Scott. In Scotland some excellent ballads, in the ancient manner, were written in the 18th century, such as Jane Eliot's Lament for Flodden and the fine ballad of Sir Patrick Spens. Walter Scott's Proud Maisie is in the Woods is a perfect reproduction of the pregnant, indirect method of old ballad makers.